$50 million in additional state regional improvement program funds to the Peninsula Corridor Electrification Project beyond the adopted budget for potential cost overruns or a shortfall of revenues to support and ensure execution of a full funding grant agreement with the Federal Transit Administration. This is an action item.
Thank you, Mr. Stamos. If I can ask Maria Lombardo, our Chief Deputy Director, to introduce this item. Happy New Year, Ms. Lombardo.
Happy New Year and good afternoon. I'll keep my remarks brief because I am going to then invite Michael Burns, who some of you may recognize as our former head of the SFMTA, but he's now the Caltrain Modernization Executive Officer, to present the item. As the clerk read, this is a time-sensitive item that's being presented directly to the board at the request of the Peninsula Joint Powers Authority, also known as Caltrain, and it's necessary to support execution of a full funding grant agreement, or FFGA, that will direct $647 million in federal funds toward the $1.98 billion Caltrain electrification project. If you're like me and can't do math in your head that fast, that's about 33% of the total project cost. In April of 2016, the Transportation Authority Board authorized Director Chang to execute a 7-party supplement to a 2012 Memorandum of Understanding. The purpose of that was to update the cost for electrification to the $1.98 billion current cost and to solidify the funding plan. Relevant to today's item, 2 key changes to the funding plan that were in that supplemental MOU were regional agreement to support the project for the $647 million federal core capacity grant. It is a very competitive national program similar to New Starts and Small Starts. And also to fully fund the project at the same time, the local member contributions were increased from $60 million to $80 million each. And in this case, the local members being, I'm just going to use it, the easy way of saying it, Santa Clara County, San Mateo County, and San Francisco County. As a prerequisite to signing that MOU, given the cost increases, the Transportation Authority and our city partners, particularly the Mayor's Office and the MTA, insisted on development of an oversight protocol for the Caltrain Modernization Program, including the electrification project, that all funding partners could participate in. That has been developed and is in place. So as Michael Burns is going to come up and explain to you the details of today's action, this is a requirement of the Federal Transit Administration that has decision-making power over the core capacity grant program. And what it is a requirement that Caltrain and its funding partners have the capacity to cover a 10% increase either in costs or a 10% decrease in revenues above and beyond the project budget. And it's important to note that $1.98 billion project budget includes a $316 million contingency already. Caltrain's been working very closely, practically daily over the holidays with FTA, all of the Caltrain funding partners and others trying to satisfy the requirement. The action before you today is a result of the negotiated agreement. The VTA, the Valley Transportation Authority, the San Mateo County Transportation Authority, and this body are all being asked to take actions today. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission has a special meeting on January 11th to take action. All those 4 parties I mentioned are being asked to commit an equal share of this 10% additional contingency. That is about $200 million in total, or $50 million from each of the partners. And lastly, I will say 2 things. The urgency in this lies in the need to get the full funding grant agreement very quickly so that Caltrain can give a full notice to proceed to the contractors. Otherwise, there will be cost and schedule implications, as the contractors have already been issued a limited notice to proceed. And for a small measure of comfort, in 2011, when we were working with the MTA to get the full funding grant agreement for the Central Subway project, we had a very similar requirement and approved a resolution committing up to $150 million in state transportation improvement program funds for that project in the event of cost overruns above and beyond the project budget, which we have not touched and do not intend to. With that, I'll invite Michael Burns to present the item.
So, Ms. Lombardo, before Mr. Burns comes up, not to put too fine a point on it, but today is the 5th day of January, and we are 15 days away from a change in the Chief Executive of the United States of America. So relative to the full funding grant agreement, is it foreseen that pending our action and the action of the MTC on the 11th of January, that the full funding grant agreement could be entered into on or before the 20th day of this month?
Yes, Michael will have the latest and greatest, and he and I, having been through this a few times, won't say anything is real till it's in our hands. But the assurances we have as of this morning from the FTA is that, assuming all the bodies mentioned act today, we should be able to get the FFGA in time.
Thank you, Ms. Lombardo. To our former SF Municipal Transportation Agency Director and the former Valley Transportation Authority Director, VTA, and now working for Caltrain, Mr. Michael Burns, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm working my way around the peninsula. So, Commissioners...
I'm sorry, Supervisor, Commissioner Tang, what did you say?
She was talking to me.
Sorry. Sorry, Mr. Burns.
No problem. First, well, I've got Casey Fromson here with me, who is going to help me with the slides. We have a very brief presentation, which I'd like to provide you with, give you a quick review of the overall project, talk about the project status, and then talk specifically about the action before you today. Before I get into that, to the Chair's question directly, there will be a change of administration January 20th. All FFGAs have to go, there's a statutory requirement that they go to Congress for a 30-day review period. What we're trying to accomplish with this is to get the FFGA to Congress for the 30-day review period prior to the 20th. What that means is the 30-day review period won't end until February 20th. While we do have assurances from FTA, from Department of Transportation of full support for the FFGA, I'm not sure anybody can predict what's going to happen, if anything, with regard to transportation after January 20th. So that's specific to your question.
Thank you.
And I'll try not to reiterate statements that have already been made as I go through, but if there are any questions, please feel free. First of all, with regard to the project, it's a $1.98 billion project to build electric infrastructure on the peninsula. We're basically converting the existing diesel train service to electric service, providing significant environmental, capacity, and service reliability improvements, as well as allowing for future extension of rail service to the Transbay Terminal, and also providing a base for future high-speed rail on the peninsula. The project is 51 miles long from San Jose to San Francisco. Basically involves building the electric traction system, poles, overhead wires, and the purchase of 96 electric vehicles, which have much better performance characteristics than the diesel trains that are running today.
And Mr. Burns, not to interrupt you, but the segment that goes to Gilroy will remain diesel?
That's correct. From San Jose, basically Tamian, which is just south of the Diridon station, to Gilroy will remain diesel as part of this project. There are currently 3 trains in the morning and 3 trains at night that serve Gilroy. As mentioned, as Maria mentioned, the project has 7 funding partners as memorialized in a 7-party agreement. As part of that agreement and as part of our discussions with the 7 funding partners, there's an extensive oversight protocol. That oversight protocol was formally approved by the JPB board at their meeting this morning. In addition to the regular updates and information provided through the website and to the board at the public meetings, the project team has a regular process of oversight over the project, as any project team does. Of significance with this project, the funding partners are very, very deeply involved in the oversight protocol that was approved today but had already been put in place a couple of months ago. And I would like to express our appreciation from JPB to the TA staff for actually initiating this protocol process with all the partners with us, and authority staff have been very active in terms of participating in the oversight, which includes risk assessment meetings, regular meetings with contractors, status meetings, and as we get into project delivery, there'll be many more sort of meetings that are related to project status. So as mentioned, the project is underway. We are advancing with the design work. Contracts were awarded in September, and we issued limited notices to proceed. The limited notices to proceed cover the design aspect of the project for both the infrastructure and for vehicles. And as Maria mentioned, the planned notice to proceed and actually the contractual notice to proceed with our contractors is for March 1st. Excuse me, I'm struggling with a cold. I went to my doctor yesterday and she told me to buck up, so I'm trying to deal with it.
We can get you some water if you want.
I think I'll make it through. So the high-level schedule that's on the screen shows the notice to proceed in March, first train set delivered 2019, and rollout of passenger service with electric vehicles in 2021. I mentioned the contracts that were executed September 15th. Just a quick summary of those. There are two major contracts. Thank you very much. There are two major contracts. The first is for the electrification infrastructure, the poles, wires, traction system. That contract went to Balfour Beatty, who was the highest rated and also the lowest cost proposer. Their bid was $90 million below the next lowest bidder. And as I say, they were issued the limited notice to proceed for design of $108 million beginning in September with full notice to proceed in March. Same thing for the vehicle manufacturer, Stadler. They were awarded the contract in September and issued a limited notice to proceed for $41 million. Throughout the procurement process, excuse me, the funding partners all participated in the consultant or contractor selection process in one form or another. Excuse me. Let me just explain quickly. The limited notice to proceed, these contracts are design-build contracts, so the contractors are responsible for the design and the construction. What we basically have done is approve them to perform the design work, and we have an off-ramp in the event that the full funding does not come through for the project to either extend or terminate if we don't get the full funding, but we will have something of value in terms of having the design work already done.
And Mr. Burns, just relative to that last statement, how does that work if you do not have full funding? Are there minimum exit fees, or how does that work?
Yeah, there would be a negotiation with the contractor. We have the authority to terminate for convenience, and there would certainly be costs involved from the contractor's perspective. It's not defined right now, but there would be a negotiation process with the contractors, and there would be a cost associated with it. Excuse me. Looking at the cost and funding for the project, the next slide, just a high-level view of where the money's coming from and where it's being spent. About $978 million is coming from the federal government. That's a combination of formula funds and the core capacity full funding grant agreement, which the request is $647 million. The other large participant in the funding.
And Mr. Burns, and I apologize for interrupting you. I mean, even if the full funding grant agreement is granted prior to the 20th of January and the 30 days of congressional review goes without any problem, it is still subject to appropriation by the United States Congress. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Subject to annual appropriation. We have $72 million in prior year appropriations that's available once we sign the FFGA, and we're in the President's budget for this year for $100 million. And the plan in the FFGA is for $100 million a year.
And that works with the project schedule?
Yes. The other point that I'll make on the funding slide is the other major sort of funder of the project beyond the local share that we're all providing is high-speed rail. And high-speed rail is providing $714 million in recognition of their need to have an electrified peninsula corridor service for them to be able to run blended high-speed rail service on the peninsula.
And Mr. Burns, not to belabor the subject, but does that mean that you guys have to do side tracks in order to allow HSR to go by?
Right. So high-speed rail right now is going through their environmental process, and as part of that process, they'll be defining whatever improvements they need to be able to operate with Caltrain on the right-of-way, and that could include additional side tracks. Right now, it's unknown.
Thank you.
That's high-speed rail's responsibility in terms of getting the environmental clearance and doing the work and coordinating with us and obviously funding any of the improvements. Quick funding update. All of the local, regional, and state funding is secured. We have agreements signed, approved by governing boards. The outstanding funding is the full funding grant agreement from the Core Capacity Grant of $647 million. I mentioned that we've got funds from previously appropriated budgets, and we're in the President's budget for $100 million. We're in the FFGA process. There are several steps in that process, and we're essentially at the very last step from a process perspective with the FTA. Once the FTA concludes their work, then the FFGA package goes to Department of Transportation and Office of Management and Budget for their review, and then once they're finished their review, goes to Congress for the 30-day review. We have commitments from the Secretary of Transportation, United States Secretary of Transportation, that they will expedite the OMB and the DOT review in order to get this FFGA to Congress by January 20th. In terms of what Maria was talking about and the subject of today's action, FTA requires grantees of mega projects of which this is one, to have a 10% additional capacity over and above the project budget in the event of a revenue shortfall or a cost overrun. What they're looking for is they're looking for evidence of availability and evidence of accessibility to those funds, and ideally from their perspective, they want to see those funds available without further board actions, especially secondary board actions being required. We have been working with FTA on this issue since October, and there were several steps that we went through to try to satisfy FTA. The description I gave you is the description that they give us in terms of what they're looking for. They do not prescribe how you get there. So we went through several iterations. The first iteration had to do with the contracts that we already have in place, the 7-party agreement, the JPB partnership agreement that's in place that lays out how capital funds are divided amongst the parties, or how the parties would work together to deal with any kind of a cost overrun or a revenue shortfall. That was not sufficient for FTA. We got that message very early in November. Our next attempt was to have the CEOs of all of the organizations submit letters that outline their commitment to the project and available funding sources that they would recommend to have available in the event of this 10% or $200 million cost overrun or revenue shortfall. That was not accepted by FTA. They were looking for a higher level of certainty of the funds. They requested, in discussions with them, they didn't request, they suggested that resolutions from governing boards would be acceptable. We pursued that avenue in concurrence with support from the Secretary of Transportation from the state, Brian Kelly, who sent a letter expressing his support and identifying the funds that he has at his disposal. And that letter also was deemed to be not up to the standard that FTA was looking for. We worked with the staffs on these resolutions, and without getting into a lot of detail, Tuesday we were notified that the approach we were taking for VTA, that's Santa Clara County, for San Mateo County, which was to use sales tax revenues as a pledge for this capacity demand that they were making, they advised us that that was acceptable. They further advised us that the revenue source for San Francisco and for MTC, we had 4 parties involved in this and all contributing $50 million each to this capacity. Both MTC and San Francisco identified STIP funds as their source.
And Mr. Burns, just for the public's edification, maybe you want to say what STIP funds are.
State Transportation Improvement Program funds that basically come, it's something of a complicated formula. I'd have to defer to the TA staff, but they basically come from gas tax revenues. So, and to us, it's a regular source of revenue. But FTA, in their review of the STIP funds, there are anomalies that come with the availability of STIP funds, and unfortunately, one of the anomalies was that STIP programming for 2016 was non-existent because there was no additional capacity in the program. So they viewed that as somewhat uncertain going forward. They were also concerned that the next 2 programming cycles are 2018 and 2020. So they're off in the future. They were looking for sources that they could identify today. And the third issue with the STIP funds is that the CTC ultimately has to approve the county's programs.
And that's the California Transportation Commission.
California Transportation Commission, sorry. So they had those issues with the STIP funds, but they did indicate that sales tax sources would be acceptable. So that brings us to sort of where we are today. We have, working with all of the appropriate staffs, developed a strategy to have VTA and San Mateo County Transportation Authority cover the entire $200 million out of their sales tax revenues for the purposes of meeting this capacity need for FTA. FTA has indicated to us that that is an acceptable approach to them. The partners, San Mateo County, VTA, San Francisco, MTC, recognize this as a regional project, as a regional effort, and are looking for all of the partners to take actions by way of resolution to support at least $50 million in capacity for this, to meet this 10% requirement that FTA has. The resolution before you today is for the $50 million in STIP funds. We recommend that be adopted. First of all, it's part of a demonstration of the partnership on the project. Secondly, it's a requirement in the other resolutions, just as a requirement in your resolution, that the other parties have to adopt resolutions for theirs to be in effect. Where we are today is we basically have, sort of a dual approach. One approach is to meet the FTA requirement using the VTA and San Mateo County sales tax measure. The second approach is if we have this eventuality, we have language in our existing agreements, the 7-party agreement, the JPB agreement, the 12-party agreement, as to how we would go about dealing with trying to resolve an issue of a cost overrun or a revenue shortfall. What we will do is, if these resolutions get adopted, the San Mateo and VTA resolutions will serve to meet the needs of the FTA for the FFGA, and as I mentioned earlier, will allow FTA to complete their review, have the Department of Transportation conduct their review, OMB, they're going to do this jointly, we're told, and be able to get the FFGA package to Congress by, say, January 20th. Hopefully it's something like January 15th, so that by the middle of February, the FFGA can be out of Congress and then executed by the FTA administrator or the acting FTA administrator. I might just add that the congressional review is a statutory requirement, and it is a review. It's not an approval from Congress. It's an opportunity for them to ask questions, inquire about particular aspects of the FFGA, and the grantee responds. For the most part, it generally is not a concern. But again, we have to say that I don't think anybody can predict what's going to happen after January 20th.
So, Mr. Burns, congratulations on getting through that with your cough.
Thank you.
And a few things. First and foremost, relative to the project itself, given the fact that you are now or have been associated with 3 of the 4 implementing or involved agencies, the VTA and, of course, San Francisco and now San Mateo counties. How do you feel about the delivery of the project itself? Like, who's the project manager? Who's
right.
the individual who is responsible and accountable for project delivery?
So we have several key people in key positions, some fairly new. I'm responsible for the project overall. The project delivery person is a fellow named Dave Couch, who has extensive experience in delivering rail transit projects throughout I'll be generous to him and say a 40-year career. I think he might even be a little more than that. He's worked in Houston, he's worked in Washington, D.C., working on the metro system, extension of the metro system in D.C. as well as in Houston. Well known in the industry, and he's our project delivery person. We've brought on a woman, Liz Scanlon, who is managing the planning department and the environmental review, who comes to us from Utah and most recently from Honolulu, and has extensive experience in terms of those aspects of project delivery. We have a good team. We have a large team of consultants who are providing the technical assistance. But I can tell you that in addition to the team, the folks that are involved in the oversight. I mean, Luis comes to many of our meetings and provides very constructive input, I feel very good about where we are in terms of being able to deliver this project. It was mentioned by Maria. We do have a $316 million contingency in the project budget. And, this is a project that doesn't have anywhere near the risk factors that, say, the Central Subway has. There's no extensive civil work done. There's no tunneling as part of it. There's very little real estate acquisition. There's, I think, virtually no business impact. So it's not a high-risk project. So we feel very good about being able to deliver the project and deliver it within the budget.
So to sum this up for this body, what is before us, and I want to acknowledge and thank San Mateo County and Mr. Hartnett, and I want to acknowledge and thank your former agency, the VTA, for standing up with real money. Is that what is really before this body today is our commitment that going forward we will provide future STIP or other resources as they become available should the contingency to the contingency become necessary.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. And I also want to thank and acknowledge our Joint Powers Board representative, Commissioner Cohen, for her work with that body, particularly today. Thank you, Commissioner. And with that, Ms. Lombardo or Ms. Chang, are there any things that
I have a question.
Want to add? Commissioner Yee.
Thank you. Thanks for the thorough explanation why we have to do what we have to do. My question is in regards to the split, I guess, of $50 million apiece. Is this something that's been? Is that the formula we've been using all along, where San Francisco pays a quarter of the cost, or how did we come up with this amount for each?
Yeah. So the JPB agreement that is in existence amongst the three counties calls for the counties to share 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in capital costs. In this instance, MTC agreed to participate, so that's what brought it down to a fourth, a fourth, a fourth, a fourth. Okay. And to date, in terms of this project, the local county shares, I believe, are following that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 formula that's in the JPB agreement.
I don't want to rehash a formula, but I'm just curious, and maybe it could be a sidebar conversation of how we got to the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I mean, in terms of mileage and everything else, it didn't make any sense to me in terms of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
In terms of mileage, it certainly is disproportionate, but it's a question of having an entire system, and I think that was the discussion when that formula was arrived at. There is another formula in the agreement that divvies up the operating costs, and that's based on boardings, and San Francisco is significantly below San Mateo and Santa Clara in terms of contributing to the operating costs for the railroad.
But out of total ridership, what percentage? What is it? 33,000 people a day? Is that total?
Well, yes, like 63,000 boardings, so 30-something people
each way,
roughly. Yeah.
And how many of those people disembark in San Francisco?
The last time I looked, and it's been a long time, it was very close to a 50-50 split between north and south travel, with the Silicon Valley commute to the south and then the San Francisco commute to the north. And I think it's still, I could get you the exact figures, but I think it's still pretty close to that breakdown.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from commissioners? If not, Madam Executive Director or Deputy Director Lombardo.
Keep this very brief. Thank you. I wish you were at our meetings, Chair Peskin. You're extremely succinct. At your desk is an amended resolution with some very minor changes, and I just want to highlight them for the benefit of the public. The primary change is the adding to the action, in addition to, let me just read this, to fund up to $50 million in additional state regional improvement program funds, adding the language or other available sources, and that is simply recognizing that should this come to pass, we will need to look at other sources in addition to the STIP to make sure the funds are readily available. That's rippled throughout the resolution. The other change that I would call out is we have added a whereas and a resolved, and this would be the second to last resolved, that references that should this come to pass and we need to look at other sources, that we will work with the City and County of San Francisco to seek those other sources. This was at the request of the Valley Transportation Authority. They felt it was important to mention the City and County of San Francisco since the City and County is actually a member of the Joint Powers Authority and not the Transportation Authority.
Thank you, Ms. Lombardo. And before we actually take a motion relative to amending the resolution, why don't we open this up for public comment? I've got 4 speaker cards. Commissioner Cohen.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm excited too. I want to get to public comment. But you heard Ms. Lombardo walk through the amendment, and I'll make a motion. We'll go to public comment if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many people involved and interested in transportation issues. No, that's not a joke. That's serious. It's important. It's a regional issue, and it's a very serious one. It's how people get to work. It's how people go and get around and get to visit their grandchildren, their children. And so this is absolutely critical. We all need to be at the table and be paying attention to what's going on. Colleagues, I'd like to specifically make a motion to amend item 3 regarding our commitment to supporting the complementary funding that's being considered by San Mateo County Transportation Authority and the Santa Clara County Valley Transportation Authority Board this evening. I think it's incredibly important that we make it clear that San Francisco is also committed, that we're putting a little skin in the game, if you will, to seeing that this project is completed. So I support the recommendations that we add the language referring to the other available sources. And with that, Mr. Chair, we are free and ready to go to public comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cohen. And with that, let me call the speaker cards that I have before me. Dr. Nancy Sewell-Cross, Mr. Peter Strauss, and Roland LeBrun. Please come forward. Mr. Strauss, you're the first, so come on up.
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Strauss. I can wear 2 hats on this for the Friends of the DTX as well as for the San Francisco Transit Riders. Both organizations strongly support this item and strongly support the downtown extension as San Francisco's next major project, rail project after the completion of the Central Subway. Electrification is both essential on its own rights and as a preceding action to the downtown extension. So again, this strongly has our support. We also appreciate the oversight protocols that have been put in place to ensure the financial interests and rights of the city and county. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strauss. Ms. Cross.
Dr. Nancy Jewell Cross. I am represent here Clean Air Transport Systems, regional and interregional transport developers. We are not very much known in the newspapers, but I can tell one thing about us that might be of interest today, and that is the extension of the extension of Muni Metro to connect Caltrain and BART in San Francisco. We are the developers of that and persuaded the California Transportation Commission of that. And one of its meetings, San Francisco wasn't there. But we were, because we think in terms of connecting rail and minimizing car trips that could be achieved by taking care of the connections rather than simply the extensions of a particular kind of transport. And we are thinking now in terms of how to reduce the traffic through San Francisco that might be mitigated or reduced by connecting across the Dumbarton corridor between Union City and Palo Alto and the Stanford Industrial Park with a light rail across the Dumbarton Bridge that would be optically guided. And we have explored the opinions of several thousands of people in the Mid-Peninsula to this. And we'd like to have you consider this as a co-development as you become informed. And the financing can be divided maybe between the three counties that would be involved in that.
Thank you, Ms. Cross. Mr. LeBron, and I want to acknowledge the letter that you sent to the members of this body, which I know we are all in receipt of, and I have read. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I guess there's no need to reiterate, but here's the letter here. First of all, I want to make something very clear. I come from Europe. I totally get rail. I totally get electrification. The high-speed line between the Channel Tunnel and London is approximately 5 miles from my house. Okay, so I get this. But there are some serious issues with this problem. The first one, I don't understand how we could be spending $2.2 billion and losing 200 seats per train. Doesn't make any sense. So that's the first point I'm making here. The second point is this system, as you correctly pointed out, Supervisor, is just not ready for electrification. As an example, in the Bayshore area, we're going to be relocating the stations and the tracks 150 feet to the east. So why anybody would consider electrifying what's out there right now?
Mr. LeBron, if you can pick that microphone up just a little bit. Perfect.
Sorry. Is that better? Why anybody would electrify what's in Bayshore right now doesn't make a lot of sense to me. On the funding point, there is a serious issue, and as gentlemen before me brought up the downtown extension, there was a court ruling in April saying that any project that goes to 4th and King and not to the downtown extension is not eligible for Prop 1A bonds. Nobody appealed the ruling, so I don't understand why we're looking at this here. So this $600 million is not going to happen. It's item 4.C in my letter. So in closing, I'd like you to amend, I know you're not going to do it, but I'd like you to amend the motion in two ways. First of all, is to make this appropriation a condition of the $647 million in FFGA. So basically, the FFGA doesn't come through, you're not going to be held up for $50 million, and we're going to do this differently. And the second one is that you take serious look at administration of Caltrain, which is currently done by Samtrans. It's a serious issue that has to be addressed by this board or somebody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. LeBron. Are there any other members of the public who would like to testify on this item number 3? Ms. Selby, please come forward.
Hi there, Thea Selby. I'm the chair of the San Francisco Transit Riders. Very happy to be here and very happy that you are having this special session today. Transportation is very important, we think, to San Francisco, and we are working all over not only San Francisco but the Bay Area to make sure that we get good transportation. So the first thing I want to do is make it absolutely clear that the San Francisco Transit Riders would urge you to commit to funding that additional monies for the State Regional Improvement program funds to the Peninsula Corridor Electrification Project. We believe that that's absolutely critical. I am also one of the founders of Friends of Downtown Extension, or DTX, and the reason we did that is that we believe it's absolutely critical that we also get the tracks from 4th and King to its home at the Transbay Terminal. We will commit, San Francisco, if you commit to that, we will commit to really working hard to get a very good revenue package together for 2018. And our models are places like Seattle and Los Angeles. We believe we thought too small and we weren't organized enough in our attempts in 2016, and we're not going to do that again. So there's commitment on our part as well that we will do our best with the people of San Francisco, who I think are clearly in favor of better public transportation, to get you additional funding for that. In addition, as Peter Strauss has already informed you, the San Francisco Transit Riders is very much for the Geary BRTEIR approval, and we want to thank Supervisor Eric Marr, who has worked tirelessly to make this happen, and we really hope that you can approve it today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and we will get to that item. It is our next item. Are there any other members of the public who would like to testify on item number 3? Seeing none, we will close public comment, and Commissioner Cohen has a motion on the floor. Is there a second for that by Commissioner Marr? And let me just say, as to Mr. LeBron's admonition, which I certainly am cognizant of, insofar as if the FFGA, the full funding grant agreement, doesn't happen, I don't think that we are in any jeopardy of committing $50 million that we would only need to commit if there were cost overruns far and above the $316 million of contingency that's currently in the almost $2 billion budget. But I very much appreciate that, because as a former and once again member of this body, painfully remember how much Transbay Phase 1 has been over budget. So having those kind of protocols, which I think we've taken very seriously, is remarkably important to me, and I know remarkably important to you. So with that, on the amendment, colleagues, can we take that without objection?
The House has changed.
Oh, the House has changed. That is true. We have been joined by Commissioners Kim and Farrell. So on the amendment, a roll call, please.
All right. On the amendment, Commissioner Avalos. Avalos, aye. Commissioner Breed. Breed, aye. Commissioner Campos. Campos, aye. Commissioner Cohen. Cohen, aye. Commissioner Farrell. Farrell, aye. Commissioner Kim.
Aye.
Kim, aye. Commissioner Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Commissioner Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Commissioner Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Commissioner Yee. Yee, aye. The amendment is approved.
And on the item as amended, can we take that same House, same call? The resolution as amended is adopted. Thank you, Commissioner Cohen. Thank you, Mr. Burns, and thank you to all of our partners and to our staff here at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Mr. Clerk, can you please read the next item?